When I was asked by Lisa to actually host this panel session, I thought it was a bit of an honour because we've got four blokes here who have an absolute wealth of knowledge. And it's a session, guys, that really could go for half a day or so if we wanted it to, because it's just so important in terms of what's next, what are we going to have taken away from us. What is there a silver bullet or anything coming through? If something does get taken away from us, what are the trends or changes that have to occur? And as I alluded to from a question from Rowan before as well, the MRLs. It's a really essential part. We can't just introduce something new or something with a permit if it's going to upset current markets. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Paul, for a start. Obviously, things are happening in Europe. What's been your experience over there with the changes that they're trying to adopt throughout Europe and I guess in particular Denmark?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think I started sort of at the end of my talk just to give a brief flavour of some of those changes. So, I mean, as everyone's aware, there's huge pressure on pesticides in Europe. We have a few sort of regulations, directives for reducing pesticide use, and we have one particular use directive which is looking at sort of how products are placed on the market, and increasingly products are having to be re-registered, or when they come up for re-registration, the requirements for registration are much more stringent. So I think we've lost about 100 active ingredients in the last since 2016. I mean, some of those probably were no longer being used, and some of them the companies just didn't bother to try and re-register. But generally, the general trend has been loss of about 100. I mean, going forward, and I don't think any of this is settled yet, still discussions, but going forward, there's a goal to reduce pesticide use in Europe by 50%. Initially, that was supposed to be by 2030. I live in Denmark now, and Denmark's probably on the extreme end of sort of efforts to reduce pesticide use, and has been quite successful, has reduced use by 40% recently. Again, I can say, I'll just introduce a few themes. I mean, that's because we have this pesticide tax in Denmark, where the environmental impact of pesticides are taxed according to their environmental impact. Huge interest in Denmark in biologicals, biopesticides. Again, happy to sort of expand on that. I don't want to talk for too long now, but happy to expand a bit more on that, where that's going. We've had in Europe the issues with glyphosate registration. I mean, that's now finally been approved again for another 10 years. We have neonicotinoids, which most of which we've lost. So those are, I guess, the general trend is we're losing modes of action. And yeah, I think I've introduced sort of a few of the other angles around that. Happy to expand on those a bit more, when people come back with questions.
So I think I'll get you to hand it on to Rick there. You mentioned the restrictions or even ban use of glyphosate there. Rick, yourself and Ken Flower have just completed a paper. I don't think it's been released yet. It has now?
It's with GRDC. It should be
Okay,
released
yes.
early next year.
And glypho was part of that. It was more a what-if paper. What if we lost some of those key active ingredients? Do you want to run us through some of the key messages you found?
Yeah, that's right, Chris. So GRDC charged us with these scenarios, these future scenarios of what if we lost certain categories of chemicals, herbicides, glyphosate plus paraquat, all the knockdown treatments, as well as pre-EMs and post-EMs, so some pretty extreme examples and non-specific, unlike nothing involving taxes or anything like that, simply losing access to these chemicals. Some of you might be familiar with the study we did almost 10 years ago now, Jackie Usman and others, on the cost of weeds in Australia. So first of all, the cost of weeds has increased a lot, and many of you will know that herbicide sales has almost doubled since that study 10 years ago, so everything's going up. But what you find in this study, first of all, at the paddock level, which AHRI focused a lot on, is just the importance of preems, as we've heard so much about today, and what that would cost at the in-crop, crop season level. Our aspect looked at what it means at the whole farm level and then therefore nationally, and that's when you also take into account something that probably hasn't received a lot of attention today, and that is the off-season control, summer weed control, fallow control, and that's where we saw some big implications of losing glyphosate and paraquat, of course, because in crop and in other sections, we could assume that you could shift to some others, like we've seen with shifts to preems and things like that. But in that fallow, what other alternatives are there that wouldn't lead to those small increases in density that can have so much cost and risk to future cropping? So that's where we saw some big impacts. So you're looking at jumps from, say, a $4 billion cost up to $6 billion if you lost some of those scenarios. But I'll just say one more thing. There's some big assumptions here, and that's assuming that you've got a range of practices that you can fall back on and shift to. And we're seeing more of the harvest weed seed control, obviously more of these practices, some of which have sort of plateaued in use. So it's also assuming in some of the other scenarios, there's a constant stream of new chemical availability as well, that you're able to switch and put more pressure on the other categories. So there's some big assumptions there that we can talk about later.
I'll let you keep that microphone over there. Before we get to Justin, I'll hand this one to you, Ken, in a minute. But from a GRDC perspective and in investments, can you give us a run what goes through your body, not physical body, sorry, GRDC body, in terms of just things like the legalities and we said again, MRLs and that. So what are GRDC looking at to assist the industry, which we've got here, the agronomists, the growers, for things that might be lost? Can you give us a rundown on what's happening there?
Yeah, Chris. Well, I'll start at a base level. So we're all here about resistance. So the underlying surveys that AHRI do, Cesar, but also New South Wales for other insects, and also CCDM, so covering the insecticides, herbicide and fungicides, is to give us that baseline. Okay, what trends are happening? So, we can then look at those risks, and obviously in this audience and also through WeedSmart, having the life science companies involved, so again, they can set up and look at where the gaps are and what opportunities they've got to mix and match to ensure that growers have got solutions. So that's why we invest in that baseline survey work, and the weed survey now is, we kicked over 20 years. Yeah. And I was going to ask that. I was sitting next to him. That's why I went that way. Paul, how long have we done the GPA one? It's on and off, but that's gone on for quite a long time. 10 years. So we've tried to do this on a really large baseline. So the same with the Helicoverpa, the bollworms, with New South Wales DPI. So we're trying to look at what these trends are, so we can know where the research or where we need to look at other solutions. Most of the audience, most of the speakers today have talked about diversity. Some of the work was led by AHRI. Really back in the early days when it's back in Warren. If I go back even further, go back to the CRC for weeds, we did identify the seed bank as an area to attack. If we wanted to decrease, longevity and manage weeds, we had to get the numbers down in the seed bank. Now, from that, with great innovation from growers in WA, harvest weed seed control come about. One of them, then developed the various mechanical destructors, and now we've got 3 on the market. So again, great innovation from Australian growers being developed with grower investment and private investment to give grower solutions. Moving on from there, our current investments to try to add diversity, we just had a speaker talk about looking at the parasitoids in canola. We've got some other work in beneficials. And also we're trying to understand even what the role of pollination is, or what the attribution of pollination in field canola across Australia. And that's driven basically by varroa mite. But in doing and starting to explore that type of work, I'll pick up, I got a quick phone call from Syngenta. So Syngenta have got this lovely diversity index camera, right, which is measuring and recording sounds of things around in your crops. It's been extensively used in Europe. Well, we'll probably piggyback with them and actually get some baseline data of Australians. So again, we'll hopefully maybe pick up some other beneficials, which we didn't know were there through our general testing or general trapping techniques. So we're trying to expand and understand that pace more so we can actually add diversity. Some of you may be aware, if you keep an eye on our tenders, earlier this year we went up with a tender for site-specific farming in the crop protection space. So it was about, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it was 12 sort of tender areas, most of them in the weed space. So it's all about site-specific farming. And again, that was the team GRDC or growers' investment up with private enterprise to get the tools operating in site-specific farming more quickly. Some of them quickly, one's with New South Wales DPI looking at soil residual herbicides and looking at the longevity of them based on soil and trying to be able to map that. So maybe something else there for you, Mark, another opportunity. I'll be able to map those on a spatial scale. With Syngenta, looking at your moving to green and green, but even on green and brown, identifying weeds, and then just changing what you're going to use on that weed. So instead of just having a mix, you're putting the active on that you want to control that specific weed. We've also got work with New Farm on the site-specific farming, saying, okay, what's the regulator going to do? At the moment, they're still taking the approach of it's a blanket spray. So how does the regulation fit into this site-specific spraying that we can actually go with a compound in a crop which actually could do some efficacy? If you put across the whole crop, you wouldn't use it. But if you're only using it on 5 to 10% of your crop, can the regulator approve that? So they're the type of things we're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. That's a good overview, across all three fields that we're sort of representing here today. Across to you, Justin. I only had a quick chat at lunchtime with you, and I sort of asked initially about what products are under scrutiny and things like that, and you said in your role you've really only got management or control of glyphosate as such. Can you just give us a bit of an overview of what you're looking at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, from a crop life perspective, to pick up really from where Rick and Ken were at, if we want diversity in the system, then we have to have a framework that encourages investment, because ultimately it's members of crop life. So the big global innovating companies bringing new product to Australia that will create that diversity. And when we think about the settings or the context of that, is that we know we're a very small market. So we're less than 2% of the global agricultural chemical market, and that means that businesses that are looking for a return on investment need to sum up where do they invest to get the best bang for their buck. And we often say in the crop protection market, look, our members compete really hard against each other, but actually the most vigorous competition you'll find in the agricultural chemical industry is between heads of company here in Australia versus heads of company elsewhere in the world, as they try and release the investment that's required to bring product to marketplace. And so in that regards, we need to make sure that our system remains efficient so that there's enough opportunity for our members to come and actually bring product to the marketplace that will provide a return to the farmer in the first instance, but also provide a return to them. And so, what creates that is about having a really robust science-based approach to the regulation of chemistry, as opposed to, as Paul was saying, a more hazard-based approach that we see with European regulation, what they call a cut-off, where they basically kind of look at some toxicological properties and just say, we're not even going to look at that, and think about how do we manage the risk. So we need to keep that risk-based, science-based approach here in Australia, and then we need to find ways to do that better, smarter, more consistently, so that again, our members can sum up a value proposition for bringing that new chemistry to marketplace. Then the next piece about that is how do we then steward through existing chemistry, because that becomes really important to ensuring we don't get resistance to new chemistry as it comes in. So even with biologicals, we're still going to need a toolkit of new and old chemistry that's been approved on a science basis so that farmers can use it safely. It's safe for them when they're using it, it's safe in the food systems, and it's safe in the environment. And we have a very proven record in Australia being able to do that. But it's also how do we speed that up? Because we know from work that Deloitte did for us and released earlier this year that we can directly attribute $31.6 billion of the biggest agricultural production we've ever had in this country, so roughly a third of that is directly attributable because our farmers can use crop protection products. So if we can use crop protection products safely, and the science says we can, we know it's a massive benefit to our system. And particularly we think about climate change, which is obviously fairly topical with COP28 going on. We know that the systems that pesticides have allowed in Australian farming have made us world leaders in terms of our climate change adaptation. The brilliance of that, though, is that those very same systems are also the systems that help us mitigate climate change as well. They encourage soil health, they encourage soil carbon sequestration as measured in our greenhouse gas inventory. And so, let's use science and let's find efficient ways to use science to enable that investment here in Australia.
Very well said. I guess I'll throw a couple of questions randomly. Paul, I remember a few years ago, the UK farmers were up in arms with the loss of neos, particularly on their brassica or rape crops. What sort of happened in that space? Have they just dropped growing the crop altogether, or or have they used cultural methods, or what's happened with that particular example?
Yeah, I mean the main problem that arose from that loss of neonics in the UK was canola, or oilseed rape as we call it. So I mean, yeah, that was a key mode of action there, and the loss of neonics caused massive problems with something called cabbage stem flea beetle, which was basically attacking crops at establishment. And without the neonics, farmers were losing an entire crop, or having to switch to pyrethroid modes of action, where there was resistance already established or resistance rapidly evolving. So they were losing options in that way also. I must admit, I'm not wholly up to date with what they've done to deal with that. I mean, I know that the oilseed rape canola area declined in the UK as a result. I think there are solutions coming through now. I don't get the sense that the problem's quite as bad as it was 4 or 5 years ago. But so I mean, the loss of neonics there was sort of changing rotations to some extent, but taking out a really important break crop from the cereals. And people would talk about, I think, I will say, I think there was sort of, was certainly evidence that some of the neonics were having adverse effects on pollinators. But I think, what the other point that was making was, you were taking, by this huge reduction in oilseed rape in UK cropping systems, there was impacts on pollinators from that through loss of an important flowering crop from the rotations.
I'll just stick with you for the next one. From your observations in Europe, and you can use Denmark as an example, has there been any other major blowouts or disasters due to the 40% drop in pesticide use? No, I wouldn't. I mean, I think that one I've just given the example of would be the classic one I would have brought up if you'd have asked me that question. No, I mean, I think it's very hard to prove, but I think one of the consequences is that growers have the toolbox has shrunk. We've all been talking about diversity, even though I know I presented some evidence of I had one case study of this case where even the diversity was selecting for resistance. But I think generally it's just reduced the toolbox. So, and that has flow on impacts in terms of resistance. And if I can just say, just to expand very briefly on the Danish, I'm not from Denmark, I've only been there 2 years. The way the system works in Denmark is they count each active ingredient. What's called a pesticide load is calculated, and that's based on
its impact on human health, ecotoxicology, and environmental fate. And basically all those classifiers come from the European Chemicals Agency, I think it is, and that enables then the regulators to calculate a pesticide load, an environmental load associated with pesticides, and then the tax is set accordingly. And I think one of the sort of unintended consequences of that is that many of the most environmentally benign pesticides are also the most resistance prone, and there's a sort of link sometimes between those things, and I think it has sort of driven this so that perhaps the more resistance prone pesticides have also become used more because the tax is lower on them in many cases.
So I was going to get into you, Rick, next as well. Again, going to your study, what were some of the trends or changes that almost had to take place, mainly from a cultural perspective, perhaps?
Paul's example of the tax leading to a 40% reduction in Denmark made me think of the contrast we've seen 10 years ago when we did almost 10 years ago when we did the study looking at the rise of non-chemical practices. And there was a fantastic suite of non-chemical harvest weed seed control, most of them, and chaff lining, tram lining, we had narrow windrow burning already in place. The seed mills were just taking off and now they're becoming established, like Ken said. And that was all in the 10 years prior to that last study. So now we're looking back over the last 10 years, and what we've found is the agronomists, large number around Australia that we'll talk to, none so far have actually been able to tell us of a new IWM practice, a practice. The crop competition, which you'd love, Chris, I know, that's a big one, okay, so that's a big practice, crop competition. But a specific practice that's come about in the last 10 years, and as an economist, it makes me think of the debatable theory of induced innovation. So when you're under pressure, things were starting to crash 10 years ago, you see a lot of innovation come through. And now with this sort of platform of multiple pre-Ms, which have been performed wonderfully well, and there's several of them, you just wonder whether that something has changed and maybe the bar's higher because these are very effective. You have to have a good new practice to beat those options. So, the Danish example makes me wonder whether that 40% reduction is leading to some additional innovation in non-chemical practices. Paul, I'm not sure whether, I don't know it's a question where I don't know the answer.
No, I wouldn't say there's been any sort of big ticket. I mean, there's a lot of interest, and I think the same is true here. Ken talked about it. I mean, there's a lot of interest in site-specific precision use of pesticides. So see and spray type things. There's a lot of interest in Denmark, but I still wouldn't say that. I mean, that's not being widely used, that technology. There's huge interest in biologicals, and I use that term quite widely. It encompasses biopesticides, but also consortia of microbes, both for crop protection, but also for crop nutrition purposes. So I think that's where a lot of people are talking. I think the danger in that is people. It's not a like for like substitution. I don't think any of the biologicals will be as effective as sort of chemistry or as reliable. But I think that is where people are looking.
I'll probably add a comment to that too, Rick, and then Ken, you can have some words. I think a lot of the innovation maybe is not in this room, and when I say that, you look at the harvest mills. 20 years ago, I used to wonder why Western Australia was so far behind SA with trifluralin resistance, and they had to go away from using it because the incorporation required was leading to erosion and they couldn't lose their topsoil, so they went away from using it, and no-till came about through some of that practice. So we as agronomists and ag advisors and scientists and whatnot, we're almost finding answers to some of the problems, but some of the innovation, I think, is exactly what you said before, when people, in particular the farmers, have got their backs to the wall and they're like, well, this isn't working, I'm going to have to come up with something better. So, yeah. Ken?
I'm going to go back to your original question to me, which I sort of stepped around. So it's about MRLs and where we sit. So MRLs need to be set for Australia for a use pattern, and that's for mainly for domestic trade. To a certain extent, it's required for us to look at overseas trade. Now, MRLs differ depending on what country you're in. They're a country-based setting, and it's based on the use pattern and the underlying toxicity to that chemistry. There is an international group called, you probably would have known, it's called Codex. It's under FAO, UN FAO. And as that meeting, the United Nations people get together and they discuss what a Codex MRL should be and whether they're accepted or not. Now, I've been to a couple of those meetings as part of the Australian government representative, and generally at those meetings, for a lot of the chemistry that comes up to set an MRL, you will have the Europeans abstain. So it doesn't help when we go to a new market, and especially the African nations probably, they'll follow the lead from the EU. And don't forget, the EU is a hazard-based regulation system, not a risk-based. So it is more constricting of what can get through. So when we're going for new markets, we have to take that into account. And our use patterns, when we're coming up with novel uses for chemistries, we have to take that into account too. That while we may use it here, and even if we're using it under a permit, we probably haven't got an MRL. We may have a temporary MRL set, but that does cause a problem for the selling of our grain, selling of our produce overseas. So we've just got to take that into account, as well as the resistance issues as well.
Look, this is a subject that I think there's going to be a lot of questions either online or in the audience. So just to even it up, I'm going to give Justin a chance to have one more comment, and then I'm going to throw it to questions.
I think when we to talk through it, it's one thing to say that Europe is hazard-based, which is what the cut-off does in their regulation, but the other thing is that it also is political. And so we look at all the rhetoric around glyphosate renewal, and it actually came down to political pressure at a committee meeting. Fortunately, the settings they've got for that require this absolute majority, otherwise the regulation goes through, because they're science-based regulators, being the ECHA and the EFSA, both found that glyphosate was safe to use and that it wasn't, conclusively found it was not a carcinogen. And yet political pressure saw absentation from a number of the major economies across Europe. But even so, at the first vote of that, 55% of the member states, representing roughly 60% of the population, voted to authorise glyphosate. And so, it's not just this issue about science and hazard versus risk, it's also the political nature of that system, why again, the capacity for our APVMA to make an independent science-based decision is so important in Australia, and we should fight to maintain that. I think the other question, and this probably goes to Ken's piece, is that the only market is not Europe. And whilst Europe is important, particularly particularly the African markets, in terms of the markets that we sell into, there's a whole range of engagement that happens at an Australian level, but also at a multilateral level. So, for example, there's a multilateral tool called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is currently in negotiation. And when you read the food and sustainability chapter, or the ministerial statements or ministerial text around that, it notes the importance of science-based regulation, both for production, making sure that you have evidence-based outcomes around what sustainability is, as opposed to, basically ideological practice-based approaches to that. And then making sure that we have science-based trade around that. When I've spoken to the DFAT negotiators that are involved in that, they're very positive, and they say, in terms of the science-based regulation of trade, there's great agreement across the different organisations, despite the fact they may have different views on how protectionist we should be around agriculture. So there is a whole range of the world that's looking for how do we regulate with science, and there's good reason for that. If we were to take, as Paul was explaining before, the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, which says, reduce fertiliser, reduce pesticides, there's been modelling that's been done on that to say that if Europe is successful in implementing it in its own jurisdiction, it will reduce its food production by 12%. That's roughly 1% of the world's food. That will mean that global commodity prices will go up by 9%, and that will send 22 million people into severe food insecurity. If the nations that trade with the EU do that, then we see global agricultural production reduced by 4%. That will mean food costs will rise by 21%, and we'll have 103 million people going to severe food insecurity. If the whole world was to adopt the European view of farming, then we'd see global ag production decrease by 11%. We'd see food prices basically double, and we'd see 185 extra million people. There's roughly 900 million people already in severe food insecurity. We'd see an extra 185 million people move into that. So there's a real imperative that as we look towards this, that science can help us manage environmental safety, as well as make sure that we meet that fundamental need that people have to eat.
Just a question straight off the top, Justin. Like you mentioned, the numbers with the reduction in food production, and therefore the numbers that are going to be malnourished or starving. Does that include the increase in food costs? Because is that going to go up further if some nations, countries can't afford food?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think it's fair to say not many people in Europe will probably starve from that. So obviously it's the most impoverished in the world that will bear the brunt of that. But then let's think about the flow-on effects of that, Chris. So, food systems are global. And the reality is, as we constrain food under current production processes, that sends a signal to increase production in other areas. And the number one way to deal with that is deforestation, land use conversion to farming. And so in terms of Europe with this grand ideal of a Green Deal, the reality is that in the interim it causes a whole lot of pain and a whole lot of cost for everyone. And then what it does is it creates government policies that are promoted by global instability to promote greater deforestation. And that's the number one driver of climate change. So we end up with this, basically really frustrating the efforts because they've taken an ideological approach as opposed to a scientific approach to farming. And again, that's, it's that scientific approach that's managed Australian farming so well, both in terms of our ability to produce under climate change scenarios, as well as our ability to trade freely with other countries.
I think we'll shoot straight to some questions. Quite a few hands going up. And Lisa? Yep. Chris?
I got a question for Justin. I'm going to change topics. I want to talk about stewardship. So, we've had probably some of the best pesticide stewardship in the world in terms of resistance management, particularly in the herbicide space, but increasingly in the others. Yet we're still facing this problem of increasing levels of pesticide resistance. So what can we do to step that stewardship up and actually get better practice out used by growers?
I think that's a whole value chain approach that has to happen. Look, our members definitely invest a lot in stewardship, and one of our premier publications every year is when we put out our resistance management strategy, and that comes at a whole lot of resource from our members to actually sit down and work through how do they manage that, with a whole lot of support. So then it's how do we actually engage into grower extension and engagement? How do we bring people around to understanding that stewardship is also good in terms of our social license as well, in terms of those regulatory frameworks. As we invest in using chemistry properly, then we actually we maintain and hopefully also gain confidence in our use. But then it comes back to maybe the first thing I said, and that is about how do we actually have a regulatory framework that encourages our members to bring new diversity to the toolbox. Because by having more tools to rotate through, more ability to use specific product in specific circumstances, then we can actually manage that resistance and actually extend the life of it. And then also, how do we have frameworks that encourages the deep investment that's required to do things like revive old chemistries in certain circumstances? How do we use AI? How do we use big data analytics to actually improve what we understand and therefore manage resistance as well? So I think I don't have a silver bullet. I don't think anyone does. What it takes is collaboration, and that's something that we're very proud of how our members collaborate through those resistance management strategies. But we've got to take a whole of value chain approach, and it's got to start with how do we improve diversity, and then it's got to end with how do we use it better on farm.
I also think, the thing that Mark's setting up, and Bayer for the resistance has sort of got a map, not as fancy as Mark's new one, but having improved monitoring, not just at industry level, down on individual property, to pick up those early warning signs, so they can understand why they need a stewardship package. We're still waiting to be reactive and not proactive. So we need those early warning signs. And the technology we're getting now is allowing that to come to a cost where a grower can afford to do that monitoring.
I'll just jump in quickly. One of the factors around stewardship is the optimism that you'll have ongoing supply of effective herbicides. And we know that farmers have been very much technological optimists when it comes to herbicides becoming available, and they've been proven correct for decades now. That what they said is likely has become likely. New herbicides have arrived at the right time, and it just strikes me with this discussion about other factors that could remove access to herbicides. It'd be interesting to see what the level of optimism is around policy or the risk of losing access to some of these, because maybe that is also something that could lead to greater stewardship than what we see now.
I've got a long question. Why is it that farmers only have access to new chemicals when a global R&D corporation decides there is sufficient ROI potential? Only then will the corporation attempt to navigate a complex regulatory system. It seems that other industries such as healthcare and pharmaceuticals experience far greater degrees of innovation due to support from governments and positive public sentiment. When will governments around the world support agriculture to the same degree as other industries?
I was going to say, can I Tony Jones that one? Yeah, I'll take that as a comment.
It's a comment.
But in all seriousness, it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to bring a new product to marketplace, and the reality is that so you've got to have deep frameworks around it. And if we're to take an example, or to use that comparison of with therapeutic goods in the health system, we actually also have a suite of IP protections that aren't available to our industry. And so that means that in terms of dealing with patent use, our members are spending time in that protection of that hundreds of millions of dollars of investment sitting in a regulatory process. And that's we completely accept there needs to be a very schmick regulatory system. It needs to be scientifically superior, because we need to we have an obligation to ensure that they're used safely. But at the same time, there needs to be those market pools, those policy pools that deal with the market failure that happens from being, a small market at the other end of the world.
I think it's just important to recognise what Justin just said there about being a small market. That is actually one of the foundational issues we're dealing with. A good friend of mine who was previously the Rural Health Commissioner of the federal government, I've had many conversations over a wine talking about this very issue in the therapeutic goods, medicines for human health. They have exactly the same issue that we actually have in terms of investment into this small market in Australia. So it's principally driven around our market size. I think one of the challenges that we actually have as a country is basically a lot of what we do will be market driven. Because we're principally an exporting nation, unlike the US where they kind of consume a fair chunk of what they produce. Europe consumes a fair chunk of what they produce. We're principally an exporting food nation, so we're in a different position, and so it's actually really important that collectively as industries and with the support of government that we actually spend the time basically liaising with those markets to ensure that we have access, that we can actually use acceptable products under their MRLs and these sorts of things. A question for the panel, I suppose, is to follow on from that. So if we are a small market, what is the one thing, like obviously we're world leaders in resistance management. Like let's look at it truthfully. Certainly for weed management, we've learned a lot and we've done some wonderful things over the last few years. But as an industry, can we, I suppose, use that stewardship and initiative that we've actually taken to actually help communicate that to our market? So we actually take a stronger market position in terms of what we do. And I'm just interested, we're going to have regulation infinitum, but can we actually use what we do and the stewardship practices and these sorts of things and actually be transparent about it, communicate? Can we actually use that to our advantage?
Look, Ron, I think we actually are in terms of when we look at trade negotiations. So one of the first things that came across my desk when I started Crop Life earlier this year was someone had FOI'd, and it wasn't me because I'd only just started, the speaking points that our agriculture minister had when he went to the EU. And that's a very common posture we see across all of the Australian government, and that is about our capacity to regulate approvals by science, and then the ability under the framework of our farmers to actually use them properly. And it is a strong talking point that we see. I heard David Jahinki, the NFF president, make a very similar statement around COP28 this morning on the radio. So I think it's worth noting that our Australian government is out there looking to demonstrate how we use stewardship as a key competitive advantage into those marketplaces. And they're also doing some work with the NFF. So the NFF's got the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework to give us some consistent and standard pillars to use to communicate the sustainability we have, because sustainability needs to be measured in the environment. It needs to be objective. You need to be able to look at and observe and talk about it, not just say we're doing X, Y, Z practices. And that is one of the strengths that Australia's had, and what I've witnessed in my time across, different agri-political and R&D roles that you've known, because I've known you for most of those times. We have been out there batting for that with our markets.
So I'm sorry, Justin. I think that this is for you as well. Look, you made reference to the need of scientific evidence and how that was very important, for making those decisions around, withdrawing pesticides and whatnot. So I guess that my question is around the particular scientific process that the Crop Life follows in order to implement into their stewardship process protocols for the different products.
So, we have a regulated system where the APVMA look at, essentially what's required to ensure that the risks are managed, and from that they determine use patterns that are available. Ken, as a former APVA member, would actually be, or staff would be able to much better articulate that process. But let's use glyphosate because it's topical, and if we have a look at the endpoints that have been used in terms of data, but on top of that, so data that's generated through field trials. But if you go to the APA website, they make it very clear that they have extensively trawled the scientific data that's come out of peer-reviewed articles and looked at this, the scientific significance of that. They have reviewed 4,800 peer-reviewed articles over the life of glyphosate, and they have looked at, articles that would infer, specific dangers, and articles that would, note the impact of that. And from that, they've formed a scientific, satisfaction around the safety of the product. In terms of the technical aspects, I must admit that's not my forte, but our members in engaging with the APMA are very well aware of the data they need to provide. But Ken, perhaps you might be able to illustrate that further?
So the regulator, or the regulation system, so to get something registered, it's with the federal government, then it comes down to control of use in the states. But at the point of registration, the APM has to be satisfied that the risk any risk can be mitigated, and that it's safe for humans, the environment, trade, and it's also efficacious and safe to crops. They're the four tenets that everything goes through. So they look at it, and yes, there can be hazards there, and the various cut-off lines. Now, if that risk can be mitigated, and if it's it might be for RHS. So if you can put some extra steps of safety in that and mitigate the inherent toxicity of a chemistry while isolating the operator from being exposed, that then can be registered. But if it can't be mitigated, that's when things won't be registered. I don't know if that answers your question or not, Fran.
I guess that my question was more about once the product is already in the market and being used, what happens during the distribution process, right? I mean, how do we make sure that if resistance is emerging, so we actually can keep track of it? We can adapt our monitoring distribution processes so that actually the product can be used for a longer time, so we increase lifespan. So how do we protect those chemistries? What's the scientific process involved? Not so much the registration of the chemical itself.
That'd be managed in the registration process, wouldn't it, Ken?
Yeah, I think it's all covered in the registration process, Fran, but post-registration, there is, we haven't necessarily got a periodic review like Europe and the US does, but if there's adverse reports or evidence from overseas that it needs to be reviewed, it'll go under review. And you're well aware there's currently eight chemistries that have got an whether you call it expedited or not, but it's had a minister's action to get the review finished. Some of them have been going for a long time, and yes, of those 8, there's 6 which are quite important to broadacre agriculture. Now, just because it's under review doesn't mean that we're going to lose it.
Sorry, Justin, can I pull you up there because we have gone well over time. My time man's actually gone, so I had no idea what was going on. But we're leading into afternoon tea, I believe. So there is still plenty of questions, I think, and I think we can follow up with some of them during afternoon tea. So would you join me in thanking Ken, Paul, Rick and Justin on a thoroughly informative session? Thank you.